I'd like you to think back to when you were a kid, when you weren't stressed out from those day-to-day responsibilities like work, bills, and general adulting. Remember that warm, fuzzy moment you had when you were playing? What were those toys and games that bring nostalgia because from what you remember, you were lost in play? Those joyful moments where you can't help but smile when you think back. For me, I fondly remember my younger brother and I spending hours in the forest, building up tiny forest cities out of moss, branches, stones. No, I didn't grow up in caveman days, but I grew up in the American Rocky Mountains in a family that really valued spending time outside. We, of course, had toys, but my most fond memories are when we were out camping and we would spend hours going out in the forest trying to find everything we could to build into a tiny forest city. But being a kid isn't always happy-go-lucky. There are some hard times too because we are learning the rules of the world, developing self-control. Like we can't just shove our friends or siblings every time they make us mad, or expertly ride a bike the first time we try. These things take time, discipline, practice. But then remember being so proud when you did realize you were behaving like a grown-up, when you finally got that skill or trick that you've been trying over and over. One 8-year-old last year explained to me how he was working on a coding challenge and he couldn't get it to work. But then he tried and he tried and he tried. And then when he finally got to work, he told me, and it was his words, he was a little bit happy inside. So that just goes to show that even the hard struggles as a kid can bring joyful moments too. Now, it's no surprise that experiencing joyful moments is one of the key principles of unstructured or free play. And according to the American Academy of Pediatrics report called The Power of Play, 2 other characteristics are intrinsic motivation and active engagement. When my brother and I were out in the forest, we experienced both of those. We weren't doing it for some external reward. We knew what we wanted to create, and we did it. We were actively figuring out how this branch could be a road, or how these giant leaves could be a rooftop. And while it wasn't that long ago, it was the 80s, so different times than today. We didn't have consumer internet. We didn't have mobile devices. And pace was just a little bit slower than it is today. But what is happening today in kids' lives? Research actually shows that kids don't have that time to really dive into the unstructured play I've just described. And according to that report, it's really critical for kids to have that time for their development. But today, their schedules are overpacked with structured activities like sports and then extended school days. One study by Unilever in 2016 said that 50% of the parents said their kids spend less than 1 hour outside each day. That's less time than maximum security prisoners spend outside a day. Now, of course, play doesn't need to be outside, but is historically one of the most common ways kids have freely played. But today, there is no time. Amid the structured activities, the only free time they have it's broken into small, fragmented chunks, which makes it really hard to dive into any free play. But you know what is conducive to filling those fragmented chunks of time? The digital world. Picking up a tablet or phone, watching YouTube, using Snapchat. And honestly, why shouldn't kids do this? I mean, we adults, we're role models for the kids, and think about how much time you spend on your device, whether for work or self-designated downtime. And when we do this, kids are watching us, hugely impressionable and impacted not by what they're told to do, but what they see. And while it's perfectly okay for us to make that choice to spend time on screens, Kids need more guidance because they're still developing self-control. But life is fast-paced. Technology is an integrated part of life, and so it just doesn't make sense to ban technology entirely from ourselves or our kids. So what do we do? This is where companies have a responsibility to design products for kids to adhere to the principles of play so that they are intrinsically motivated and actively engaged. Now that sounds nice, but what does this really mean? This means that we need to have a more thoughtful, research-based approach to designing and developing kids' experiences. This is about turning product design for kids into a process of thinking about the micro-emotions they experience, the highs and even the lows, because if they are facilitated right, feelings of frustration can bring joyful moments too. This means that we need to tap into kids' developmental and emotional needs, storytelling, self-expression, creativity, to develop meaningful and memorable play. What this doesn't mean is using the same addictive behavior techniques that are used to keep us adults scrolling and clicking and liking. Because we know better, but we still do it. Kids don't know any better. Who is taking advantage of kids in this way? I have a couple of examples, first of which is Snapchat. Now, one could argue that Snapchat is good for kids because it helps them feel connected and develop their social relationships. Completely fine. What isn't fine, however, is a particular feature that uses extrinsic motivation to manipulate kids' behavior, called snap streaks. Now, for those of us not on Snapchat, a snap streak is created between you and a friend after snapping each other for 3 consecutive days. After that point, a little flame with a counter launches, and that counter keeps going until one of you doesn't snap for a day, and then the counter stops. So what happens is kids become so obsessed with keeping that number going that then that becomes their motivator of snapping with a friend, rather than the pure joy of sharing a moment with a friend. This feature uses extrinsic motivation to instill addictive behavior in unsuspecting kids. Another example is called the Play Impossible game ball, which also uses extrinsic motivation and has over-gamified one of the world's most basic and oldest toys, a ball. This game ball has technology inside of it, so every kid's toss, tap, catch, throw is tracked with a mobile app. I mean, whatever happened to the simple fun of playing catch in the backyard with a friend? I think this image from their promo video really says it all, where we have a bunch of kids outside in a cool setting, holding balls, staring down at a screen. Not really a picture of intrinsic motivation. Now, both Snapchat and Play Impossible use technology, but technology is not the problem here, and so the solution isn't to remove it. The problem is the lack of a thoughtful approach to the design of these technology features. So the solution is for these companies designing these products to invest more in their R&D process to ensure they're not creating addictive behavior in kids, but instead they're guiding meaningful play. And this approach isn't impossible to achieve. I have a couple of other examples to show. The first is an online global community of millions of kids called Scratch. Scratch is a free coding platform for kids to create their own interactive stories, animations, and games. It was based on research by MIT with the vision of enabling kids' creativity and collaboration. And just like Snapchat, it also is a social digital platform. However, the developers have focused the features on giving kids a way to build on each other's projects. So the engagement is triggered by that notion of creating something meaningful together. And these features have been tested and iterated with kids over years in order to guide meaningful play. The second example is close to my heart. 10 years ago, I founded a startup called I Create to Educate, with the mission of bringing hands-on learning into the classroom. Our flagship product was also based on university research, which proved that stop-motion animation was an effective process for increasing kids' understanding in science and math. 5 years ago, I sold the company, and since then, the acquirer, Hugh, has brought the product from the classroom into play. Stop-motion animation is a way for kids to create digital stories by physically moving objects in the real world in small incremental movements, using a camera and software to take pictures after each movement. The software then compiles all of these pictures together to play back at a certain speed, ultimately creating an old-fashioned animated movie. Now, while this process can be time-intensive and tedious, I've observed thousands of kids around the world actively engaged, like you see here, in the physical world, motivated to create and share a digital story, ultimately triggering that joyful moment. Now, these are just a couple of experiences of many others out there that are developed with the principles of play in mind. However, with the increasing reliance on technology, there are many other experiences out there that aren't. Kids lack the self-control that we adults have, so we shouldn't expose them to these products that have the addictive technology features. Instead, we should develop these experiences so they adhere to the principles of play, providing intrinsic motivation, active engagement, and giving joyful moments. And we should expect companies to take on this responsibility. If you are a parent or teacher, I would encourage you to reflect on your kids' favorite experiences. Do you feel they're actually guiding their development? Now, I'll leave you with one final reflection. We've been discussing today on the importance of play in kids' lives. But what if you also took a moment to combat those addictive technologies to engage in play? Something that's reminiscent of those joyful memories you reflected on earlier. Because maybe play can be just as formative in our adult lives, too. Thank you.